Hi everyone, this is V for Vernon. Today I'm interviewing William Costello, who had gained some kind of fame, I think notoriety maybe, for his article, Step Up Your Dick, Why Do Incels Deserve Better Advice, if I got the title right. Yep. And I got a cool interviewer with me.
I'm Elizabeth Hobson, leader of Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. Pleasure to be here, gentlemen.
Absolutely.
So yeah. Can I start off with a question?
Yep.
I've known you, William, for 2 years now.
Yeah, I think about 2 years. Yeah.
I've just been in the lead up to this interview, just recollecting our meeting at the Battle of Ideas 2018. So I was wondering what you kind of remember from that.
Yeah, I think that was the first time we ever crossed paths, and I think it was during one of the debates we recognized similar kind of thinking from our questions from the audience, and it kind of snowballed from there. And since then we've established a great friendship, and we've shared the stage debating about feminism and gender politics and different issues. And I always tell people, Elizabeth, I'm going to make you blush a little bit now. Whenever people ask me how I got interested in anything in the men's rights kind of movement, or how I became an MRA, well, first of all, I would kind of say I don't think I am a men's rights activist, just because I don't think I'm an activist in the same way that someone like yourself is. But I am interested in men's issues. And as a commentator, I'll do what I can to kind of change the cultural conversation around the way we talk about gender politics. But to the second part of the answer to that question about what got me interested in the movement, I would have to give credit to yourself. And I often say that if you weren't the first person from the MRA movement that I encountered, or one of the first people, I think I might have been put off the movement, if I happened to meet someone else. But you were just such a positive example of somebody who is so obviously not ideologically possessed, and just a great representation of nuance and balance and fairness to any issue, not just the MRA movement. And I suppose the second thing that got me interested, and that we might have recognized in each other, is that I'm heavily influenced by the work of Dr. Warren Farrell, whose kind of philosophy is all around real egalitarianism, that if one sex loses, both sexes lose. And I'm kind of very influenced by his book, The Myth of Male Power, which was it was a counterintuitive book to me at the time, and it was my first time dipping my toes into the water of that there might be spheres of life where men do not have power, or aren't seen as oppressive, which seems obvious to me now, but at the time it seemed counterintuitive, because I had been given the myth that just history was a oppressive male patriarchy. So that's kind of how we met, and what we've been doing since, Elizabeth. So I'm very glad I ran into you that day at the Battle of Ideas.
Likewise, thank you for that.
All right, so about your article, William. So what was the response like? I understand it was mostly positive, and what were some surprising bits of feedback, and were you surprised at who gave that feedback?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I was surprised that the response to my article, which is a pretty divisive topic and a pretty provocative title anyway, and I write quite provocatively, I think, but it was positively received by incels, normies, and even some feminists alike, which is either a sign that I'm doing something really good or really bad, but hopefully your audience will think it's something good. Incels, I feel, are kind of misrepresented due to the most extreme voices in their community being used as representative. And when this happens with any other community, we rightly rail against it. For example, we can think of the harmful stereotype of Muslims as terrorists based on the actions of a small minority, but we rail against that. We also, as society, usually have sympathy for, or at least, yeah, we try to prop up or at least have sympathy for the most disenfranchised minority groups, whoever they happen to be. But we don't do this with incels, so that tells us something interesting. So in response to my article, to answer your question, I've seen people who are usually extremely kind and gentler type politics people say things like, life is hard, get over it, and nobody is entitled, and all the usual tropes. And they suddenly just turn into the most hardline Ayn Rand philosophers of total individualism and kind of almost, no sympathy. So that's a strange kind of thing to see happen. There is I've noticed a distinct difference in the way incels are kind of talked about, or my article was critiqued from men and women, and there's a distinction there. I feel that men, when they kind of criticize incels or lampoon the whole idea, I think they're trying to kind of signal something about their own competence in this arena. So it's a joke to them, something they want to indicate something about their own kind of sexual prowess or abundance, that they don't struggle with this problem. So it's almost comical to them that someone would forge an identity around this level of ineptitude. Sorry, my watch is trying to listen to me. The idea of incels forming an identity around their incompetence is very anathema to a lot of men. I think, a lot of men think that if they were an incel, or if they were dealt those cards, that they would simply lift themselves up by their bootstraps. And I think they demean the complexity of challenges that incels face in society and the challenges they represent. Women, on the other hand, I feel kind of lampoon incels because they're trying to maybe shy away from acknowledging just how superficial, immutable, hierarchical and cruel much of sexual selection just is, and they want to maybe dishonestly kind of pretend that the incels' plight is due to their own bad personalities and nothing else. That's the end of discussion. In terms of the wider discussion, I think that just as much as incels have a comically kind of hyperbolic, fatalistic and reductive view of the dating world, I think we as wider society have a kind of trivializing caricature of what an incel is as well. So as much as possible, I'm trying to maybe correct for that. But, overall, I've been really happy with the connections that my article has kind of led to. For example, a feminist academic called Dr. Sarah Daly, who I'll have a joint YouTube episode coming out with very shortly. We're actually going to plan a formal letter exchange as well on the topic. She's writing a book about incels, so that will be very interesting. I was invited to do a presentation for the International Conference for Men's Issues, which was a brilliant event organized, and I was really thrilled with that. I was also pleased that my material had been used on an undergraduate psychology course, which was the world's first male psychology module, which is at Sunderland University, with Dr. Becky Owens there. And she actually circulated my material amongst her students just to give them a kind of a different perspective on the incel phenomenon. And I've just kind of, it's snowballed. I've got a lot of invites to podcasts and YouTube channels like yourself. So yeah, I'm happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, a bit on the dishonesty and why women kind of, and I guess the broader society kind of finds it convenient to rail against the incels. Well, I wonder if kind of the hypocrisy has anything to do with it. And by hypocrisy, I mean, so I'm going to borrow a passage from your incels article. I'm going to paraphrase a bit. Men who have lots of sex are seen as studs. Now, this is referring to women, kind of like the slut shaming kind of context right here. Men are seen as studs, but it seems to me rather that those same men who may be the studs are also demonized for kind of going after women, for whatever context, just having general lust for them, or and at the same time they're denigrated for not getting the sex. So I'm just thinking, which is it? Like damned if you do, damned if you don't, or damned if you can, damned if you can't. So what are your thoughts on that one then?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and it's a very timely question actually, because I read something specifically about the male gaze, and I had a few encounters that actually kind of tack on to that very topic. There's a writer who I admire a lot called Ralph Leonard, and he writes, in my opinion, a lot of the best pieces around kind of the expression of male sexuality in culturally. And
He did that the Empress is not wearing clothes. Is that the one?
That's right, and the piece I'm kind of referring to is a kind of a condensed version of that longer read, but that was brilliant, and he's published a kind of condensed version of that piece for the online publication Unheard, and it's all about the demonization of the kind of the male gaze, and in it he writes that the female gaze is portrayed as Edenic and spiritually dignified, in contrast to the demonic and depraved nature of the male gaze. And the implication is that the male gaze could only ever be brutish and oppressive. That's to have a truncated view of male desire, that women can't be reduced to their bodies, but the vast majority of men don't merely see women's bodies as pussy to be pounded or punching bags to be sparred with. It is something to be awed and respected as a source of erotic contemplation, just as the male body can be for women. The male gaze isn't an expression of male sexual power over women. It's just as likely to be an expression of alienation, of vulnerability, a yearning for tenderness, and a nervous assertion that beauty is good and to be preserved in the midst of an increasingly ugly and colourless world. It seems like the only people not permitted to soliloquize about male gaze are the men themselves. Which I think is just a beautiful passage I had written down to quote from there that kind of sums up what you're kind of talking about. Ralph also wrote an interesting piece about the ludicrous criticism that Barack Obama recently received. I don't know if you're aware of this, for his autobiography, in which he discusses reading particular books or learning about different political...
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. He kind of used Marxist passages to pick up chicks and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, so he tried, but he inadvertently became a bit of an incel, and he didn't have much luck. So I always joke to any incel followers that I have, you know, because I would encourage incels to try and ascend and you break out of the incelosphere. If Barack Obama can do it, he's a good example that you could maybe follow. But the whole point is that as soon as you attach the explicit goal of attracting women to any form of kind of self-development, which, you know, let's face it, attracting women is a pretty big motivator for a lot of men and has been for a long, long time. But as soon as you attach that explicit goal, it becomes kind of misogynistic. And, you know, or it gets labeled as misogynistic, which is, you know, if you're an incel, you're simultaneously kind of told you're scorned for your innate inability, but also you're scorned if you try and game the system or learn to improve yourself for that specific purpose. It's very interesting. Just another point on the idea that men who kind of are very hypersexual are kind of scorned. It's a very juxtaposition type of view, because there's something called supernormal stimuli, which is basically the idea that society and culture is now drenched and saturated in sex and sexuality, but you'd often get scolded if you notice that fact publicly, particularly if you're a man. So it's very strange.
One idea I've had is that sex could be, like, the mystique of sex could be starved from both ends. Like, you know, it could be starved by just outright denying it in the puritanical side, but then when it gets overexposed and made practically just exhibitionism first and no mystique, I think that also has a starving effect, almost kind of like Tantalus, almost kind of like, you know, just being in that river, just not being able to have a drop of drink.
Right, yeah, that's a kind of beautiful way to put it. And it manifests in this kind of retreat from a lot of feminists to the new kind of counterintuitive tradcon feminism. And I've had a few backs and forths on Twitter with some tradcon feminists who feel that modern women, and this is their own words, not mine, that modern women are too naive to cope with the mores of sexual liberation, and they end up getting tricked and manipulated by fuckboys who are disproportionately benefiting from sexual liberation. Now, there is an element of truth to this because, you know, this is happening because of what I would call Tindernomics and the effect of hypergamy, the move to online dating, and the erosion of socially enforced monogamy. This does mean that a minority of high status men, maybe about 20%, are kind of monopolizing the sexual interest of the majority of women who are only interested in those high status men. And this is very interesting from my point of view, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, because it's almost like a return to what is known scientifically as effective polygyny, which, you know, that's been the mating system of about 80% of human society. So it's very interesting that that had been kind of kept at bay for a long time through social norms around monogamy, but is kind of being stripped away now. But I find the kind of this tradcon feminist kind of vote of no confidence in modern women to be somewhat almost demeaning to women, that they can't cope. That's their own words. And it's further evidence to me of something I've said to you a lot of times, Elizabeth, that I like and respect women a hell of a lot more than a lot of feminists do. So I know I remember there was a lot of gasps in the audience when I said that at Goldsmiths University, Elizabeth, but I stand by that. I trust women to cope, to not just cope in modern society, but to thrive. And it seems like some modern feminists don't trust them to do so, and just don't think they can.
Absolutely. I wonder, going back to what you said about, you know, encouraging incels to kind of ascend out of their inceldom. I think, you know, one of the things I'm encouraged, and I think that the incel communities are potentially really positive for these, you know, disadvantaged kind of largely men. But, you know, I have a slight concern over the way in which they are encouraged to identify with the label. And, you know, I think if you're about in this community, you know, you'll quite often run into people who say, hello, my name is Bob and I am an incel. And, you know, the thing that I think is, like, I find that about as interesting as when someone walks up to me and says, hi, I'm Bob and I'm gay. You know, it's like, for me, who you are or aren't having sex with is one of the very least interesting things about you as an individual. And, you know, I find with the incels that I know, that the more you get to know them, you know, you start out with a conversation about how they're an incel, and, you know, then things start coming out about, you know, because a lot of this community, obviously we have disabilities overrepresented in that community, and, you know, you'll find that perhaps they're working on behalf of disabled people to improve services and, you know, access to this, that and the other, and actually there's a lot more to them than not having sex. And so I think while the community is positive, I do worry that there's a navel-gazing obsession with sex that's not healthy within it.
Yeah, and I suppose they look around and see the sense of meaning that others seem to form around their sexual identity, and they think, well, the only way to do that is to form an identity around my kind of sexual relationship with the world, even if it is, you know, if that means inceldom. I think you're so right to point out the importance of identity, because the definition of incels is very hard to kind of tack down. And I think it must involve an embracing of that identity, because it's objectively impossible to prove that somebody can't gain access to sex or relationships. And also, so, it must be, someone must identify, because there's a difference between, you couldn't put a time metric on how long someone mustn't be having sex for before they qualify as an incel, because, COVID might have made incels out of a lot of people, right? So, there's a difference between a dry spell and an incel, for example. So, the identity element is huge. But I think even more significantly is that it's crossed my mind that a lot of incels would be very reluctant to leave that identity because it's seductive. They get a lot out of it. They get a sense of fraternity with others and community, a rich lexicon of kind of, shitposting, fun kind of language to use, in-group, out-group kind of terminology. They have a ready-made tribe, a real or perceived grievance, and a common enemy. So that's very seductive in terms of a sense of meaning. So why would they choose a mating market or a dating world that they would describe as ritualistically humiliating, exhausting, and expensive? So, when the choice is framed that way, it's easier to kind of understand. A lot of people say, oh, I can't believe some people identify as an incel and want to pride themselves about this element of their life. But when you can see it like that, it's a no-brainer for a lot of them. And there's a lot of aspects, perhaps, that I know you want to get on to talk about OnlyFans and stuff like that. That might be actually encouraging a lot of incels to retreat into online worlds rather than take their place in this gauntlet of a dating market. If I could just say one more final thing about the male gaze and that kind of demonizing of male sexuality. I think it was very funny. I very recently had an interesting Facebook interaction with a friend who I can only describe her as very woke, very ultra radical feminist kind of friend. And she posted it was a funny meme talking about how women should deal with the aggression of leering men who are staring, right? Who are staring at her. And her meme that she posted said that you should stare right back just as aggressively and start muttering witch spells under your breath, and that this would be successful. I commented on it laughing my head off because it would be so counterproductive. It would actually, if somebody did that to a man who was staring at a woman, he would just immediately come over and start talking to them. So it would be totally counterproductive. Because men are evolutionary hardwired to kind of overestimate sexual interest. So we see interest even when there is none. So this tactic was so funny. I had to just comment on it and tell her how ludicrous it was. And it reminded me of, I read an article where a woman was so annoyed about receiving so many unsolicited dick pics online that she decided to send vagina pics to every man she started talking to on Bumble.
I'm familiar with that one somewhat.
And it just completely backfired. She couldn't believe it that 97% of the men wanted to meet her. They loved this. And I encourage your audience to look at that article. It's so funny seeing some of the reactions. But my conversation with her got kind of a little bit more interesting than that, because I pointed out to her that gay men and lesbian women, in my experience, are far worse for this kind of staring phenomenon. And I got to talking about this with my girlfriend, and she said that, what kind of world does this woman want to live in, where all the kind of sexual frisson or tension is kind of sanitized and stripped away? The age-old trope of locking eyes at the bar is kind of the lingering glance. That's the first move in almost all sexual encounters, and that's a lot of women like that. So who is this feminist to strip that away from people? And it's also kind of very demeaning to real aggression, and to women in general, to suggest that they just can't kind of handle this type of what kind of approach would be deemed necessary if this is seen as too aggressive. And then also there's the fact that majority of sexual advances have to be initiated by the man. That's what most women report that they would prefer. So it's kind of an awkward one, because along the way you're going to have a lot of collateral damage of rejection for socially anxious men who have to kind of run this gauntlet, and also a lot of ick factor for women who have to deal with the trial and error of men figuring out what might work in this kind of approach game. But yeah, so it was just, that was a funny interaction I had with a feminist online.
Well, one way I define masculinity is that which aims and takes, and I define femininity as that which invites. So I think it makes sense that men have to be like the how do I put it, the
Aggressor.
well, not even aggressor. That's kind of got the intent of violent connotation there.
Initiator.
Like active. How about active? Yeah. So right. So I think actually, it makes sense, and it's kind of a bad state of affairs for women to not kind of realize that about men and women interactions and about themselves in terms of their own nature. But I want to kind of harken back to what Elizabeth said about basically overrating people, overrating sex of people, because it's simply not so interesting. But it seems like I think people have sexual values, but they end up sacrificing them just to have the physical contact itself. Does that make sense?
From my point of view, coming from an evolutionary psychology perspective, I would probably disagree a little bit about the importance of sex and kind of relationships and stuff like that, because if you think about it, our modern skulls still contain Stone Age minds. So in our psychology, we're built on a kind of a psychology that is built around humans who would have existed in very small tribes. So if you think about what sexual rejection might have meant in our ancestral environment, it could have been catastrophic. You could have been an evolutionary dead end. So now in the modern world, someone like an incel who's facing a lot of sexual rejection, that can kind of compound, and it's painful all over again. So that is, in my opinion, female sexual selection is the main thing that shapes male behavior and behavior. So, it's the only game in town in terms of evolution, because there's no point in even surviving. There's no point in outrunning a lion if you're not going to be sexually selected for from an evolutionary point of view. So, standing still and not doing anything from an evolutionary point of view is the most risky strategy. You have to kind of shoot your shot. Our ancestors, we're here because our ancestors took risks and approached a female to try and be sexually selected for. And, congratulations to them all. They all were successful because we're here. So a seriously long evolutionary chain that, for an incel to contend with the fact that they might be in an evolutionary dead end, what that might do to someone's psyche, compounded over and over again, that is significant. So I think, and also we need to think about, I might agree with you, Elizabeth, that maybe someone is more than their sexual identity, but that lack of access to sexual relationships also means becoming involuntarily childless or involuntarily all the wider kind of community that you get from relationships. It is about a lot more than just the sex. But what that sex contains or leads to or kind of tacks onto is significant.
I think I wrote an article called Dear Young Men, and it was kind of, referring to the same sort of idea about how it was directed specifically to men who were seeking to have, relationships with women. And it's such a minefield now. It's insane. And like you say, on the one hand, the facts on the ground are that women expect men to initiate an awful lot of the time, which I think there is space to work on, to be honest. I think we do have space to go, come on, women, you're liberated. We've been through the sexual revolution, take the initiative sometimes. It can be, it can be an awful lot of fun. It can also be humiliating and disappointing and tragic and hilarious, you know, but if we are gonna grow as a society, then I think that is a positive way to go. But, you know, realistically, there's a limited number of women who are gonna be interested in pursuing taking that initiative, and so men are expected to, and you know, the responses are so diverse. You know, they might well be, you know, they might, or they might be rejected, or they might be rejected with absolute scorn, and you know, they might even find themselves in the modern day either on a disciplinary at work, or you know, even in a police cell. There was a guy in France, you know, I think it was Paris, in fact, the city of love, and he was prosecuted for wolf whistling at a woman. I was like, you know, no flirting, we're French, for God's sake. It's like, it's a really disastrously awful situation, you know, and your girlfriend, the other Lizzie, is absolutely right, you know, when she says that what kind of world do these people want to live in that's devoid of all the colour and the sexual frisson, you know, it is that gives us colour and interest and meaning. So yes, I entirely agree.
What you said reminded me of, I think, what's the journalist, Elizabeth, that Jessica Valenti, who you can see side-by-side columns that she's written complaining about catcalling and then complaining that nobody catcalls her anymore. So 5-year gap of her 2 articles. What you said also got me thinking about the workplace element, because that now in the Me Too era is kind of, you know, do not go there is almost the party line on that. But as Warren Farrell points out in a lot of his books, a lot of people meet their partner at work. Both my brothers met their partners at work. So, you know, you either, Warren Farrell frames it that people either meet their future spouse at work or somebody who they'll be in a disciplinary bout. So, you know, it can go either way. So who would take that risk? You also got me thinking about with women taking the initiative and kind of, I'm a big believer in, you know, if women want different behavior, then reward different things, because men will follow suit like that. That's the only game in town for us. So I'm interested in a piece of research that was done around what young people are looking for in their relationships. And just 5% of young women said that they would desire a situation where they work full-time and their partner works part-time or no time at all. So, you know, in terms of closing the gender pay gap, how is that going to work if they, you know, they don't want to have the stay-at-home dad. So, you know, men are going to maniacally work 60-hour work weeks in the workplace to get the reward of the female sexual selection. So that's an interesting one.